Sydney to Seoul, from London to Rome. We pay the wages that build dreams and homes. It's data, it's tech, it's strategy too. It's complex, it's vital, it's built for you.
All right, welcome to Global PayFest 2026. I'm excited to be here with Nancy Romanyshyn. Like that, I pronounced your name right. I usually make fun of it and pronounce it the wrong way.
Very impressive. Very
I
impressive.
know. After 20 some times of doing this, you'd think I found, is that the first time I got it right?
Well, I mean, to be fair, your last name is Luitjens, so I've heard more than one person stumble over your name as well.
It is. I think between the two of us, there's a very low percentage chance when people have opened for us or we've had an MC, they are not super excited when the two of us pop up there.
No, pretty much a disaster.
I'm stoked. We're going to get the chance to talk for about an hour about pay equity in the AI era. I will say this will be a little weird. Nancy and I have done this, we say 20 times, ballpark, give or take 20 times together, almost always with a crowd and always with questions. So what we've tried to do is go through the general flow that we've kind of dialed in over a period of time and grab some of the questions that continue to come up. And then we are just going to kind of dive in and go. But before we start, can you give your background?
Okay. So I'm a longtime total rewards practitioner. That was really how I spent the earlier part of my career. So I stood up the compensation function at the first company I worked at, and then proceeded to go into consulting a few years after that and worked at Willis Towers Watson back when it was Towers Perrin, and then it was Towers Watson, and then it was Willis Towers Watson. The latter part of my career there, I was a broad-based comp consultant, but the latter part, I was leading the North America Fair Pay team because I was helping my clients understand why, after we built these incredible frameworks, that we took so much time to implement, why there was still these issues popping up around pay equity. So I was leading pay equity analyses projects, and that's when I met my current employer, Syndio. So back then it was about taking my client's data, doing some magic behind the scenes, and then presenting it, only for it to kind of get old, right? The minute they kind of went through it. With Syndio, I was working with my clients and we were doing live analysis, and it was really exciting to kind of see how different, the different results people got from doing the analysis in that way, and how it became a diagnostic for other things in their pay program. So I joined Syndio over 5 years ago now, and it's been great. So that is me.
Okay. For those who don't know me, I will not go through all my history because you were at one company who changed names many times for a while. I was at many companies through the years, not Towers, but at some like Mercer, Korn Ferry, et cetera. The difference being I come from the development angle and have always worked in HR tech. The line I use a lot is I have never been a practitioner. I like to help them, but their job looks like it sucks and it's hard, probably too hard for me. So I've kind of gone through the angle of, being in the software side and trying to help practitioners do what they do, almost all of it around comp and ben of some form or fashion. As we start, I think the way we were going to frame this out for people is we are going to kind of go through kind of the pay equity process. We'll dump in a little bit of AI stuff in it, but then at the end, we'll figure out how AI is playing in all of this process. So I'll start with you because the place we always start to make sure we're on the same page is define pay equity and transparency.
Sure. So pay equity is kind of, I think of it in a narrow stance. It's essentially making sure that you're paying people the same for similar work. And regardless of any sort of other characteristics or the things that you wouldn't want to pay them for. So, Nancy and Sean are in the same job. If their performance is the same, if they were hired around the same time, those types of things, and, essentially are doing the same job, they should be paid pretty similarly. It shouldn't matter if, say, Nancy has red hair or is left-handed. Or, as we say, it's, really what we study typically is making sure that we're not paying people differently based on gender or race, ethnicity, or other types of characteristics. So that's pay equity, but pay transparency is much broader. A lot of times they get conflated because people don't want to be transparent about how they pay until they know that they've got pay equity right, because they're worried about the ramifications of the inconsistencies that often happen when we're paying lots of people at scale. So pay transparency is not just about the numbers, say being transparent about what we pay Nancy and Sean, but also the process by which we define, how we come up with those numbers, why there are differences, how we can, maybe Nancy or Sean can make more money. Those are all sort of in that envelope of pay transparency.
Yeah, and I always think of pay equity as just the internal market, and there's less ramifications to it. Although the transparency piece with Article 7, which I know technically we're in the slot for North America. So Article 7 is the EUPTD's kind of right to information. And so super exciting reading if you want to go, country by country, but employees will have access to understanding where they're paid in their range and compared to their peers on differing levels in different countries. But that does create kind of this unique transparency piece, even though it's about pay equity, that the two, I think you said conflated. That's a big word for me, Nancy. I'll have to Google it while you're speaking. I just say the two get mixed up a lot, but I think they are to me, Article 7 was the bridge that really started to put the two together, because pay transparency means you have to share the external range potentially, and that people can share what they make, which then inherently comes back in as they're going to figure out where they are paid equitably, internally, or not.
Yeah.
I think the two are two different avenues that hopefully get us to the same place of being solid payers. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I do like the way you said pay equity is basically if we go ahead and we do all the maths, and we'll talk a little bit about it, and are we paying equitably for the right things, and are we taking the biased items out, and then what is the delta that somehow we got to for maybe good reasons. I use COVID a lot in there. We had to pay a lot during COVID, and so for new hires or post-COVID. And so now, that might be a rational reason why we had something, but can we mathematically get to a point that we have explainable, justifiable business reasons for paying, not unjustified, biased reasons that we should not be paying for?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I know you love data, and to me, it's just become an opportunity to collect more data and get more precise about the whole process, a process that I think we've sort of had this false sense of precision in the past when we've amassed, amounts of, say, market data, and we're missing kind of that piece. I like how you said the internal piece. What are we doing in practice? So that's, and the issue is what we're doing in practice, even it's been internal, it's been something that hasn't been as transparent. And yeah, right to information is as a level of transparency we haven't seen before, just because it's actually reporting, average wages by gender for smaller groups of people. And it's not going to be that much of a stretch for people to figure out, and even just disclosing their own pay. The challenge is, you and I probably over this next hour are going to talk about a lot of different things, like showing ranges. That's another, part of EU pay transparency, right? It's and it's not as specific as that. Depending on how different countries transpose the law, like how that's going to play out. Is it a range? Is it something else? What exactly are you disclosing? We've seen that happen in the United States with the different pay transparency laws, pay scale, which is not a term that any of us use, but it's in the laws, so sure. So I think it's been a real challenge for anybody in this space to just rationalize and make sense of just sort of the myriad of things that are out there. But I do think we're sort of on the brink of companies starting to decide for themselves, what we're going to disclose, what we're going to call it, how we're going to explain it. But you need to begin. And that's the issue. It's before you can kind of go down that path, you need to understand what it is that you have.
Yeah. And I think as we talk about that, I think for the most part, I think people have wanted to be good payers. I just think the business decision environment and variables at that specific point in time. But I do think it's important to call that out. And then how do you remedy that over time? So with all that in mind, why, Nancy, why are people wanting to pay equitably beyond the, because the EUPT told me to?
Well, I mean, I think that why people want to pay equitably is because it's what you designed your program to do. I think that's been, for me, it's sort of been, it seems so like simple to say, but if I designed it to do this thing, like I talk about global job architecture, I implemented, a lot of global career frameworks, and we went to a lot of trouble to set up those ranges, right? And to put people in the range, figure out where people are in the ranges. And at the end of each of those projects, I would hand my client this, it used to be paper, and it became files, but they were compensation administration guidelines. It was the playbook. It was the rule book that went along with the program. If Sean is new to the job, you pay him lower in the range. If Nancy's competent, you pay her in the middle of the range, And then, it wasn't long before people could see that, well, but that's not how pay is happening in practice.
Mm.
Why? And doesn't that mean then if we designed it because this is supposed to help drive consistency so that way you're not overspending or underspending on your talent because you're spending massive amounts of money to pay all these people. Like if you don't know how you're spending your money, isn't there a really good chance that you're not getting the return on investment that you think you are? And worse, like you're wasting money. So to me, honestly, the why is just, it's the bottom line. Don't you want to make sure, think about any other large sum of money that you manage in your life. If I was like, I don't know, I went to the grocery store and I don't know, I thought I was going to spend this much and I ended up spending this much. And I really don't know what I spent on. It's kind of crazy, but that's what we do with our payrolls. We don't really know what we're getting, and we're hoping we have guidelines, and the challenge is because you have lots of thousands of different people making decisions about how they should be spending without the sort of the context and the process by which they could be following your program. So yeah, I think a lot of it is it's just about good business. Just like in all things, that's the why. And then obviously as an outcome is, the talent risk. So there's an element of, people leaving if they're finding out that they're not being paid fairly. There's the element, obviously there's the regulatory element, but I think it's really about, how motivated am I if Sean and I are in the same job and he's making a boatload more money than me. So I might feel like, well, maybe this isn't the place for me.
Yeah. And I think a couple of things on that. I think it's about maximizing talent. So to your point, you're going to be unmotivated. We're not going to work well together. I'm not going to want to talk to you because I'm going to have to tell you, I'm making more money, and doing the same amount of work. So I think it's about maximizing talent. I do think good employees, driven employees want to know what they can make here, what they can make at the next role. That transparency also helps with career frameworks and career ladders. And so I think that's super helpful, that people really understand what the rules of the game are and that the company's paying fair. And to attract good talent, to know that, when you go there, they do pay fair. They are a fair payer. If I do work and I do better work, this is an impossible scenario, but if I did better work than Nancy, then, I would be paid equitably for that. And there's rules of engagement for that. So I think that to me is a big why. When you think about all those whys, talk really quick about the geographic differences between, I'll probably say for the most part, the Americas, and, Europe is probably I'll say three, if you want to call it Latin America, North America, and EU. How are you seeing those, different right now?
I mean, I think one of the things that's top of mind is just the regulations. So we're seeing, I know for us, for a lot of our customers, when it comes to pay transparency, they were sort of on this path of being more transparent, say, in their Americas, say, areas, and that was driven mostly by, say, the U.S. legislation at the time. And then once EU PTD passed, it was like, whoop, you know, like, wait a minute, let's shift what we're doing. And if we're going to be preparing and kind of getting our houses in order for transparency, let's look at what the EU is requiring. It was also just sort of the overwhelm. You know, the EU, there's so many things in the directive. And then just the act of then each member state kind of saying, oh, yeah, and then we have our things, too, that we want you to do. So from a regulation standpoint, you know, we see that sort of that variety. And that's where a lot of global companies are really struggling to come up with sort of one consistent message and then being locally relevant. You know, how do we play things out in that sense? You know, in some respects, though, you know, there isn't a lot of difference because of that sort of global consistency. And so you're seeing, we hear a lot of the same things. You know, I would say universally, everybody's worried about managers being ready to have pay conversations, right? Like it's like there are certain things that, you know, being competitive, you know, all of those things, those we see are pretty consistent. I think it's just global companies are really just trying to figure out what is the motion and then really evaluate if we are doing that in the EU, in some of our EU countries, then should we be doing that in other parts of the world? You know, how consistent should we be? And really, I think everybody has agreed they're aspiring to greater transparency. They want to be in a world where they could not worry as much about things and everybody can explain everything. And, but they're just, there's just a lot of resistance between feeling ready, that level of readiness, and then honestly, leadership being ready. The folks are still meeting a lot of sort of barriers with their own leaders, just being reluctant to be transparent.
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with, I mean, this simple fact of like, you know, if P50 is out there, do you pay above or below, right? I'm no math wizard, but half of you have to pay below P50, right? And so I think you have that piece. And also from, even if you pay below P50, do I have a pay equity issue? And how fast can I fix that before, you know, I have to be as transparent as possible? I do think you see the global companies kind of driving the marketplaces for talent because they have to do it. It's super interesting to watch. You know, we've got a number of countries in the past couple of months kicking the can down the road. Some of them were the ones that were initially all on board and driving it. And then they're like, well, actually not so fast. But you're seeing companies still go along with that. And I think what they're doing, from what I've seen, is they're picking and choosing what makes sense now. So I don't have the regulation that's out there. So I might not have the right to information, which could be giving an employee, you know, 2 to 4 weeks, anytime they ask, having to give them information. And since that hasn't been dialed out yet, you know, really built out, they're not doing that. But we're going to go back and actually pay equity, you know, get our house in order, and we're going to take this time. So I think you're seeing them still continue forward momentum. They just don't feel the pressure of some of these items that they weren't really ready for on some of this. I think when you think about the different regions, I kind of put Latin America and North America similar-ish. I think people are following the rules, but they're not going too far above and beyond, except for a couple of companies. And I'm just hoping that those couple companies then show that, hey, we're a good payer and that's a competitive advantage. And then actually just the competitive nature will drive pay equity and people being paid fairly in the marketplace. And, you know, that becomes a hiring advantage because people want to go work there. And that's what help drives it forward. Whereas EU PTD, I feel like it's a little bit, I don't want to say they don't want to be fair payers, but they have this thing that's out there that, you know, there are rules, there are, you know, that are going to be out there. And I think what you said earlier is also true. We don't know what the fines are going to be. I'm sure they're going to be stiff or maybe or whatever. I actually think the court of public opinion, though, is going to be significantly worse for those that are bad payers,
Yeah.
you know, and being known in the market to be on the highly technical term I've deemed naughty list of payers. They don't want to be on that list, right? You don't want to be listed there. You don't want to be the beginning of the press as somebody when this came out and it's there.
There was a study done by, I think, the European Commission back in like 2000, where they said the thing that really motivated companies to do the right thing, if you will, it was the court of public opinion. It was really more about that. I think, honestly, I think it's, to me, pay transparency is really what's helping employers tell a better story about how they pay. And I think, yes, underneath that is, well, we better be paying fairly, but like fair, consistent, competitive, like it's the whole story. And so the more transparent companies can be, even just around expectations, what this particular role pays, I think they're better off. And then, and the why behind why they pay what they pay. One of the things that I keep coming back to too is it doesn't really matter what companies do, because employees are going to ask the question. And if they're not asking you, the OpenAI came out with a report where they're asking ChatGPT, it's 3 million times a day. There are prompts around what I should be paid. How do I negotiate more about my job? And so they're asking ChatGPT, and ChatGPT is not an authority on how you as a company pay, your philosophy, all those things. So it's, you know, you're better off as a company trying to find a way to lead that conversation and remind your employees why you pay what you pay. You know, I think for a lot of employers, it's an incremental thing, starting with a little something, you know, and building on that.
Well, I think in the past, I think the knee-jerk reaction to pay equity and transparency was, this is bad for us, right? And I think a lot of that has to do with, you know, some of us are the age when the department was called personnel, and you didn't talk about pay, or it was illegal to talk about pay. And that there's still a little bit of that out there, or it was taboo to talk about pay publicly. And so HR and Total Rewards didn't share their pay philosophy. It was the black box, which then leads to kind of the negative mojo around the Total Rewards team, that they've got this black box and there's no plan, or all the negative terms. But I see this as more a huge opportunity to go to your senior leaders and be like, well, to your point, you know, we either share our philosophy or they make up their own, or they type in all the people from their department into, you know, Claude, and it determines what the pay philosophy is. Yeah. So we can get in front of this. And now I think it's a great opportunity for Total Rewards teams to build a communication plan around and lean into the fact that we kind of have to. Because in the past, I think, again, a lot of the negative mojo was they're making it up or they're doing whatever. And we all know that was not true, right? I mean, Total Rewards people, sometimes to their detriment, to the 15th significant digit, have figured out what, you know, something should pay, right? That was never the issue, right? The issue was, how do you communicate it, because we weren't allowed to share that number. Right. So I'm super stoked that I think it'll come out, and that they'll be able to put a communication plan and basically say, here's how we pay and why, and this makes it equitable. I think it's super exciting.
Yeah, I think, well, that's the flip. You and I, we talk about like compensation marketing, right? Like yes, I think Total Rewards was always at fault because there was such a need to make sure you're getting it right, because it's people's pay. There's nothing really more emotional than that. So, yeah, and to a fault, you know, I'm not ready, you know, analysis paralysis. I don't want to show you the analysis, but we would be better off kind of realizing, kind of picking our heads up and just saying, wait a minute, like I'm losing sort of the thread of the conversation. I really need to, let me focus on all the good things that we're doing and why we do what we do, and kind of market that. Yeah, I wrote that policy. I actually wrote for my first
on that typewriter behind you. That's how long ago.
But I wrote the policy about you're not allowed to share your pay. And it would be a performance infraction. It was like, because it was our, you know, it was company information, confidential information. And that was how we justified it back then, which is you're not allowed to do that. So,
which is great. So let's assume we want to be a good payer. We're going to communicate it when we get there. How do you see the best practices in companies getting started kind of down the pay equity transparency journey?
Well, I think part of it is a lot of the stuff we just talked about now is, which is kind of, if you want to call it the business case, you know, kind of the why you're doing it. So first thinking about and considering and at least setting up for yourself kind of a true north, like what are we doing this for? You know, so because your approach is going to be a little different. You're going to involve different people. If your approach is more about, hey, I'm worried we're doing some naughty things, we're on the naughty list, and so I'm going to want to, you know, I just want to do an analysis over here in private versus I really want to get to the heart of making sure our programs are working well. So, and you can do, they're not mutually exclusive. You can begin with one and build on that and go to another. But I think first it's really just kind of establishing why you're doing it. That's going to help you then understand kind of who you might want to involve. And then it's going to be about your data, really thinking about like what data you have and what you need to get started.
So being more North American in this time, and same thing a little bit in Europe, I'll get to the data, but one of the first things I suggest people do is get counsel. For those that don't know, Nancy and I are both married to attorneys, so it hurts us to tell you you need them. So it is the first thing, and I think from a North American perspective, it protects your processes, to Nancy's point about the data, not the data. So always be really clear when a lot of companies start, they're like, well, all my stuff's protected now if I get counsel. No, your analysis is protected. So which we'll talk about when we get started. The first thing to do is just get started. So it protects some of that as you learn, but it does not protect your data. Someone has the right, and that'll vary by state and country as well of your protections that are there. But that's a general good guideline to go find somebody, you know, in your region with counsel to figure out where are my protections, not just on my analysis, but also what data. So when you start to pull in data, and then I'm 100% with you, Nancy, like what data do I want to start with? And take a look, and how do I get that data? You know, how do I bring it into one place? What, you know, whether I'm doing it myself or I'm using a software tool, where do I pull that data into, and what do I need to have happen? And then the third thing I would say is just start. You and I agree with that. You see too many people now, you know, my data's not perfect. My analysis might not be perfect. Just start, and you will quickly figure out where you've gone awry.
Yeah, that's one of the, I always say, you know, the not having the right data or having incorrect data, that's still a finding. You know, it's still a finding that, oh, we have to get that information in order to make sure that we can make comparisons that we can have confidence in.
Yeah, I think I use the example a lot. You go back and you want to pay, you know, you want to look at tenure. And, you know, you run the analysis, and every, you know, half of the company was hired on, you know, May 30th, 2022. And you're like, crap, that was the turnover date for the new HRIS, and someone took a shortcut. So like, can I actually get that data? Is that something I can worry about anymore? Or where do I go get that from a prior system applicable? But those are really things that you don't think about until you run the first one. And then because you know your business, it'll just highlight itself, and you'll be like, well, that's not possibly true that no one's worked here longer than 4 years. Like, let me go back and figure that out. So I think that's the piece, really just functionally getting started. And you can start with less data than you think you need. So if I can't get tenure, I can't get something, you know, you really need the basics, you know, and then you'll go back and figure it out as you go. I think we've had one company recently, you know, they put it in there and like they were all males. Like, so someone had been cheating, you know, the data wasn't cleaned in one system, so the default was male, so they had to go back and figure out, okay, where's in this other system that I can pull the data in that's actuals. And so you'll figure that out really quick with a lot of you know, with a lot of the data if you just get yourself started.
Yeah, I usually say, I mean, there's a kind of a short list, because my thing is always, if you're paying people, then you probably have enough data to analyze. So as long as you know, if you have unique identifiers for employees, you know who they are, you have whatever characteristic you're trying to analyze. So typically, say gender, you know, like you just said, that is sort of a deal breaker. We can't analyze unless we know what that is. And then it's the compensation, and usually folks start at base salary. You can bring in other things, but that's a good place to start, because most of your comp programs work off of that base salary. And then And then you want ways to make comparisons, how to group, like for like jobs. So that's job functions, families, or departments. And then ways to control for differences. So that's saying, like you said, hire date is a good one you just used. Using their grade, their location, level. You can, and if you don't have that perfect, you can begin with maybe some reporting relationships, but things that you likely already have in your data. And that's part of the analysis, is just understanding what you have. To make those comparisons. And you may have it that for some of your population, you're pretty confident in what you have. And then for other parts of your population, you're not. But it doesn't mean you can't analyze all of it. You are. You're analyzing everybody. And then you just have sort of different steps that maybe you're going to take with one segment versus another.
Yeah, the job architecture underlies a lot of this. So as you create cohorts, you create buckets. But again, I usually tell people, would you share your job architecture with a friend? And if you're like, not so sure, it's not great, maybe take a first pass at it, to shore it up a little bit, because I personally know in projects I've done, it's my least favorite thing to do. So I know it's not super fun, not as cool and sexy as some of the other stuff, but it is really important. But to your point, if it's good enough, then you can get started. Now you can start to catch your outliers in that first a couple initial passes and be like, okay, they're a unicorn, they don't really belong there, or they're actually still in this group. Why are they in this group? Or why were they categorized? Especially individual contributors, you see a lot, like, why are they here? They should be here. Like, you can figure that stuff out so that you can get yourself squared away and do your analysis. But I personally find it so much easier to just go see all the outliers hanging out outside the circle, or outside a standard deviation, or whatever you want to do, and basically be like, what's this? And then go tackle and see if it's consistent or one-offs.
Exactly.
So when you get the analysis, what are the first couple of things you look for when you get the initial first couple of passes analysis? Now that we've caught all the outliers, we're going to assume we did a couple and caught all the crazy obvious things. What do you typically look at in the first pass of analysis?
So, you're talking about, if we're running, should we talk about how we're getting outliers? And because you mentioned standard deviation.
Sure, because sure. Let's talk about the types of analysis that are out there. Do we want to talk about which one's better? Why don't, for those, because it's all over, and I know there's people that are in deep with pay equity, and then we've got people who are bouncing in. So I'll let you, if you'd like to, talk about multivariate regression, or really the way that you typically look at pulling all this stuff together.
Yeah. I mean, I would say, usually, because sometimes we do get asked questions about, like, can I just look at, are you just looking at averages? Are you, and so linear regression is really great at just, you're basically building an equation around how you pay, and you're controlling for certain things, but you're making sure that you're making the right comparisons across different groups. And what you're able to do is it's definitely considered the gold standard. It's something that many organizations have done for a really long time, is run multivariate regression analyses, where they're able to really suss out, if I have a group of people and this is how they're being paid, I can see what are the drivers of pay within that group. And I can explain, say, why people are paid differently when I control for different things. So if I control, for instance, I have a group of people, they're all sitting in finance, and I control for grade, I know, using linear regression, I can see how much that is accounting for the differences in pay that we're seeing. So it really does help you sort of unpack what are the drivers of pay, and get at, again, like where Sean's going, which is those outliers. So right, a great first pass is, I guess to me, Sean, really my first pass is how strong is the model. That's usually, what I want to know is just, have I explained why we pay what we pay? So basically, if I feed it, mathematically, hey, if I take everybody and I apply our job architecture in some way, shape, or form, right? And I control for those things that are sort of embedded in the job architecture. Does that explain, can I create a strong model where I can actually, what Nancy's actually making is pretty close to what the model would predict Nancy would make. And then to your point, then it's like, well, wait a minute. Why is Sean such an outlier? Why, I see this unicorn, so here's the model. Nancy and Sean, it would predict that Nancy and Sean would make the same thing. Why is Sean all the way up here? Then those are the things that, I think it's great to look at, because then you discover things about individuals. So one of the things we usually do is we'll do something like, okay, Nancy and Sean were predicted to make the same thing. They clearly don't. Let's look at both of them. And let's look at other things that we haven't accounted for, to maybe those will explain to us why we're seeing those pay differences. So then what we find out is that, oh, it's because, Sean can sling code, or, whatever. Sean is like this. He's like this multi-talented. He's got all these skills. Nancy can't do that. So we're actually, those are skills that we pay a premium for. We haven't encoded it. We didn't formalize that. And so we can either build it into our model, or we can say, you know what, Sean is such a unicorn. We're going to pull him out of this group. He shouldn't be compared to Nancy because he's so different. So those types of things are the choices that you're able to make, so that way you then surface other, say, outliers or things that don't look right, where people kind of are falling out of where you would expect them to be paid.
Yeah, I think back to just get started. I'm happy to have another couple hour session with people if they like, and talk about things like when you start talking about multivariate regression. There's log linear, which I think a lot of people use. Blender Oaxaca is the other big one, which kind of in theory controls for, some other items. And I would tell you, it doesn't freaking matter. Pick a lane, whatever lane is fine, and then be super consistent. The results are close enough that, at that point we're starting to really fix and solve smaller problems. And so, but we will see people get really wound up around which model and analysis paralysis, because I'm going to have this model for a while, and just don't. The other thing is it does control for all the variables. And so I know in the UK you report on, UK, raw pay gap. You could actually be within the 5% raw pay gap and not be a good payer. And so there are two different types of maths and two different types of comparisons. And so the raw pay gap, while legislatively is the thing, I know I have to go to the UK later this year, so I probably shouldn't say this, but I'm not stoked about that. I actually think they'll come around to having a more defensible mechanism with multiple variables, because you will see people who are inbounds who are just bad payers and fall within the legislative. And you'll also see people who are out of bounds who might be 7 or 8%, but actually they're fair payers. It's just the way the math works out different, because it's it's an adjusted kind of average. And that's significantly different than controlling for all the variables that are out there that happen over a period of time. And so I do think it is, to your point, the gold standard, but I actually think you should make it the standard. How you make it gold over a period of time with how you get your variables and your foundations in place is key. But I think it is the true best way to look at it. And I don't think people have to overcomplicate, that sounds like I need 50 variables. You don't really need that many. You just need to control for those decisions and make the adjustments. It doesn't have to be a lot, because I think people they misunderstand that now that I have a multivariate regression model, I must have multiples and multiples of variates, and I'm going to have to go find them. It's not the case. And so it is not as big a leap from raw pay gap as you think to get there.
Yeah, I think the difference is that, like you said, that it's more precise, because you're able to control for the things that, again, you say you pay for. So it makes total sense. The other thing is, a lot of the reporting that's required, like gender pay gap, legislation, it's in the aggregate. It's these big, ginormous numbers. And so for my part, I honestly do not find them very interesting, because they really don't tell me, just like you said, Sean, it's like, okay, so here's your pay gap report for your entire population. What is that really telling me? Yeah. So I think it's much more interesting to do, something like regression analysis at a much more granular level. And then that way too, the other thing is you can also recognize in the math that it's not one size fits all. So say, going back to Nancy and Sean. So Nancy and Sean, they were in the wrong group. Sean he should have been in another group, And now, what I wasn't controlling for is, the specific skills he has. So he's doing, different types of programming, or any number of things. He's a whiz at, some of the latest AI technology. And those are, we're going to pay a premium for that. But within a group of like for like, it would distinguish him from other folks that are in similar jobs. I can be much more precise. Applying a premium like that or a hot skill like that to, say, maybe the group I was in, if, say we were both in finance, that have no meaning. So that's the other thing, is just, it allows you to really do diagnostics. That's what's always been fascinating to me. Yes, it's about making sure that we're not doing things that are, wrong, unintended, unlawful. And it helps us then, the positive side of that is it also helps us understand what it is that we're paying for. Because these may be things these are patterns that we should know so we can pay more precisely. We can gather more data for, maybe some of those skills. We can be more intentional around how we're paying for those skills and design better programs around them. We can recognize that, those skills are popping up over here, and we're not paying for them consistently because they're not in the same group as Sean, but maybe we should be. So those are things that just help you run your business better when it comes to managing talent. And it becomes this great sort of like fact finding. You're really analyzing and understanding and diagnosing what it is that you're doing in your organization. So that's what I find fascinating with it. And I think that's what I think makes it worthwhile, to make sure that not only do you do it, it's not a one and done, right? You're doing it again and again and again.
So let's go through and assume we've done our analysis, and now we want to remediate. Okay. So I know it's a big word for me. I know.
Well, it's a legal word. That's
legal. I have to use it. So we have issues. How are you seeing companies tackle this in the near term? And then how are you seeing them put defensible items in place to make sure it doesn't happen again?
I think, in the near term, what they're doing is building sort of on that analysis. They're, deciding how confident are we in, say, the results of this analysis. So, where do we have, oftentimes our customers, they are going to prioritize, say, systemic differences. So we talked about outliers. It's actually a different approach, right? Because sometimes that's my technical term for that that's the onesie twosies. I'm interested in, if there's a whole group of people that seem to share a characteristic and there's an issue, that's typically where folks are going to prioritize that we seem to have a systemic issue where we didn't build in a discount for people with that characteristic in our pay program, but boy, that's showing up over here and here and here. And so what they'll often do is they'll build in budget to make those types of corrections. And I think of it as, it's similar to making market adjustments, just like if you have a group of people in a job that, we're, underpaying, and we're worried about that. It's a similar motion. So a lot of times they'll prioritize those dollars. They'll build it in, and usually they're doing it during annual planning as part of, like, say, overall market adjustments and merit. And then the second thing is really understanding, again, a legal term, root cause, but really understanding why was it showing up, especially if it's a systemic thing. So is there something going on? Either is it about how specific managers are making decisions in an ongoing way? Do they need more training? Do we have to understand that? Is it something about a program? My favorite thing to pick on is promotional, caps on promotional increases. That's a really great way to continue systemic issues. It's because we do find, for instance, statistically, there have been some studies where, for instance, women tend to change jobs less than men. And especially when there's been several instances, and I know I've experienced it with doing analyses for some of my retail customers. It's a classic thing with store managers and assistant store managers, where if you have a population of women and men, the women are almost always paid less than the men. And what you find is that it's often because the women have come up through the ranks to get in that role, and the men are hired from outside. And so it's similar compression issue. It's just, unfortunately, it's a compression issue that falls along gender lines. And so those are the types of things that companies then have, they want to prevent it. So it's really about like discovering that first and then saying programmatically, okay, hey, we need to be we need more governance in our, pay decisions that we're making for these folks, and making sure that we have those alignments in place.
Yeah, I think there's three places you tackle this long term. So the short term, to your point, is merit cycle. And so if you have any type of performance matrix or merit matrix where you've got position and range and you can stick to it, theoretically, you help a lot, right? So if I'm lower position and range, I've got a bigger increase in someone higher position and range. So if I have been a bad payer along gender lines, in theory, that starts to get fixed during that period of time, because if they're paid higher for no good reason, especially if they're in the same performance band in particular, or if you just do it based on position and range, it starts to solve itself over a period of time, assuming we can stick to it, which we'll talk in a second about that. So I think that's one piece. There's the pay equity set aside. So you're seeing companies basically grab a half a point or a point. The big thing here is using that pay equity set aside after you've gone through the merit process. So I think it's human nature, and you've seen that it gets taken away or moved. So if Nancy's been underpaid as a female, and I apply the pay equity set aside up front, then managers a lot of time will be like, well, Nancy already got some money, so I'm going to take some of her regular increase and give that to someone else, because I just don't want to have that bad discussion with somebody else. And so you want to deal with that merit set aside, or that pay equity set aside, secondarily. Let it run its current cycle, go through the management, and then be like, now what do I still have for problems, and apply those funds out there at the end. The other two places you kind of hit on, one is the promotional increase. So I'm a big believer, and it's not a percentage, actually. We move to the appropriate position and range for that person's experience with a minimum. Because to your point, if we just go on percentage base, even if we give the women in the retail stores the same percentages as the men moving up, we make a bad problem worse. Right. It's just like giving merit increase of 3% across the board, peanut butter. All we do is make a bad problem worse, even though that was the easiest solution. The easiest way for a manager to pass down an increase across the company is just to say, we got 3%, we're going to give everyone 3%. You just inherently make your problems worse. The other place is during the hiring process. And we know, gosh, I don't know what the actual statistical percentage is around it is, but the number of compression issues caused by TA versus anywhere else has got to be over 50%. And it's understandable, right? I mean, they're trying to get a butt in a chair. They've got pressure from all kinds of people to get that person hired. They need, every day or week or month that position goes unfilled, costs the company money. Compression is not high on their list. So compression for the folks in payroll, don't want to over explain, but basically, you're moving someone up higher in the range for no good reason. And so now Nancy's been in that role for 5 years and she's making X, and, the only way we could get this other person in is to pay them X plus 10,000, pounds. Now we've got a compression issue, because all of a sudden, like, now what happens, right? And long-term total rewards or comp or HR has to deal with that, because if they are paid the same, that person's not going to get as big an increase as Nancy. And with pay transparency and equity, we're going to have to explain that. And so there's a lot of really cool tools out there that are talking about offer management out there, or at least bridging the gap between where total rewards is created. Here's the bands and the ranges, and here's what's going to happen if you pay here with these people, and giving that to talent acquisition. So even if they make the same decision, it's an educated decision. But I think that's one big bridge that has not been crossed over the past couple of years in the past. Talent acquisition was paid on two functional items, right? Time to fill and number of recs. Had nothing to do with compression.
Right. I think I think there's really an opportunity for companies to engage in better processes. I feel like that's been the missing link for many, many years, where total rewards folks have tried to control it with the frameworks and, like I said, the compensation administration guidelines and all those the rule books that nobody's following, right? Because they're trying to make the best decision they can with the information they have and in the time that they have. And I think we haven't indexed enough on process, governance and process around how you make that decision. And the fact is, total rewards doesn't make the decision. It's the hiring manager, it's talent management. It's a number of different people, but it's never total rewards that's actually making the decision. So in order for it to be made right, they have to somehow influence the decision. And I think the only way you can influence the decision is just have a better process, have a better governance around it.
So with all that said, got about 10 minutes left. How does AI play into, specifically, we've seen a lot of the processes in different places. How are you seeing companies and or vendors layer AI into the process?
I mean, I think one of the concerns is not getting this right. AI is incredibly efficient, and so it can efficiently scale bad decisions. So I think, right. So I think that's one of the concerns. So what I'm seeing a lot of companies do is it is really about, there's a couple of different things. I see it sort of like an incremental thing. So one is, can I have a sort of a comp coach? Can I have talking points? Can I have some understanding of why, what are the things that go into making a good decision? And can I have that present at the time as, people are making decisions? So just using, some of that, I would say, I don't know, now I guess I would call it sort of basic AI, where it's just, really just having that information available around your policies and practices. I'm seeing a lot of companies are building some of their own, as well as, a lot of vendors, right, are incorporating that into their offerings so that way, as you're making a decision, as you're working in a system to make the decision, you have some of that coaching that is really helpful. And then right down to talking points. We go to manager readiness, who are the people making the decisions? So having and sort of educating, right, the manager as they're making that decision, just supporting them. So AI is super helpful in that. But then behind the scenes, right, we're seeing a lot of AI be used to create and make much more efficient the gathering of information and the analyses behind it. So if we think about, what does a perfect world look like? A perfect world looks like whatever information I'm given to actually make, like we were saying, like offer management, it includes an internal pay equity analysis. It includes, yes, the market analysis, yes, my salary range, yeah, maybe it even coaches me around, you say you're hiring for a P3, but what you're really hiring for is a P2, that kind of having that sort of surround sound of information. And then even better, if you could pull in, I've decided I'm hiring Sean, and it knows, about my interview process with Sean. It knows that Sean wants certain things. So we're seeing a lot of that, just the ability of AI to take a lot of information and synthesize it and offer it up at the right moment. But that said, like I said, you can scale, bad recommendations, bad decisions, pretty quickly. So it really requires, that building, that sort of architecture behind it, and people who know the outcomes that they're desiring to be involved, as well as a lot of testing of that to make sure that you're doing it right. And then, of course, that you're doing it in a compliant way. So, but I do think I'm really excited about what AI can do, because I do feel like it can really help us with that governance piece that has been elusive and ignored for like way too long.
I go back. So you mentioned the data. So I think the data normalization is a big thing, being able to pull things in and recognize it. The other piece I think is in the job architecture and marrying jobs up to that. So people have different locations, et cetera. Every location has their own job descriptions, has their own pieces, and AI does a great job of concatenating those into buckets and saying these 4 jobs across these 5 locations kind of look like the same freaking job, and they belong in this bucket. And so it does a good job of getting you a starting point to be like, actually, that's a true story. Even though we're in the same state or country or whatever, these are the same jobs. They just all over a period of time grew locally. And so getting that foundation and being able to build a cohort out, and then, then you can control for location or other things that are there. I think on the merit side, what we used to think about is having quartiles or tertiles for, your merit matrix and, your position range. You can go to deciles, you can go 20th. It could be an infinite piece to where you're actually driving towards something like give the increases based on this budget, based on maximizing, pay equity analysis turnout. And so you have an infinite range that's there, because modeling it before would have been ridiculous, to model it how many different times. And so you can model it a number of ways. What happens if I do a standard, good example I use a lot is, what if I did a standard process through merit and I had a 0.5 point pay equity set aside? What would that do to my outcome? What if I did a regular merit plus 1%? So I took 1% for the merit. What did that do to my pay equity analysis, and how did that pay? And that used to be tremendously difficult to run. And so now that can all be done. And then the last thing is, I think the talent acquisition piece is big. I think allowing them to really understand what's happening and then automate some of the workflows too, so that, the manager who doesn't always see the number and the ramifications can see it all on the fly and understand, like, if you do hire Sean at that, like, you're going to have one angry Nancy next year for this many years, or, even some quick math. How many years would it take you to remediate that if you gave him a 0 and her the standard increase, and you're like, I'm going to have to deal with this for 3.5 years? Like, not fun. That's not going to happen. So I think
angry Nancy.
Yeah. And I think the last one I'll add is, assuming you get to pay equity, and you get to some place that's near normal, that means people are getting paid equally for equal amount of work. Well, what if I want to up level my department? What is that going to cost? Because in theory, if I need to add 20K to the next hire, is that person better? Are they doing the same role but better? Like, am I going to have to move my baseline? And so I think all that modeling becomes super cool inside, with AI being able to look at all the different scenarios so much quicker than we used to.
Yeah, I agree. I think I think because part of the challenge, I think, with, kind of coming back to what we were talking about in the beginning, pay transparency, is that we're making all these decisions now out in the open. So we don't have the security of, I'm just going to, I'll just go deep and run a Monte Carlo analysis or something in my Excel spreadsheet, whatever. You can't hide from this, and all of these decisions are happening so quickly, and they are happening out in the open. So the more that you have at your fingertips, and if the AI, if AI can kind of support that, if you're running the right things and teeing up sort of that information and helping drive, the outcomes that you've been trying to, through the governance, through that process, and the modeling, the scenario planning out. I mean, yeah, I know you and I have debated that question about how do you up level somebody in your department and have pay equity. And I think those are decisions that, it's not like they're new decisions. You've been having them. It's just that maybe you might have made a different choice in the past because you knew it wasn't going to be out in the open, but now it's going to be out in the open. So now what choice do you make? Right.
Yeah. This has been great. So, it's a super cool time if you like working problems. We've termed this a couple of times a wicked problem of pay equity, wicked problem being something that never ends. So it's always going to be worked. So if you like working cool problems, whether you're doing it for the legislative or the right reasons, it's a super cool thing. AI is going to make a big difference. Nancy, thanks so much for joining, for, having to spend an hour with me. Cindy should owe you hardship pay.
Thank you for having me, Sean. And you're always self-deprecating and selling yourself short. It's been a great conversation.
We are easy to find online. I would argue if you can't find Romanyshyn or Luitjens online, that's a natural selection issue. We are always happy to jam either one of us on this stuff. We love this stuff. So if you have questions, comments, or you have a unique situation that you've been working through, that's the stuff we love to hear about. So feel free to drop us a line. I appreciate it. And thanks everyone so much.